like a divorce, after several years of reflection, with the benefit of more thinking and more knowledge, I think we now have a new and more nuanced interpretation of why Singapore separated.
But if that's the case, would actually textbooks need to be rewritten?
I think so.
Perhaps we can start by actually discussing, now with a lot of materials unearthed, the whole narrative of Singapore's road to independence seems to be a bit different now. Especially a lot of people will be asking, was Singapore actually kicked out of Malaysia, or was it a mutual agreement? I don't know what kind of views you have.
We all have to review our memories of separation. Every generation must do that and rethink separation in terms of their current needs, identity. The analogy I'll offer here is that, like a divorce, you ask the couple a year after they separated, oh, terrible, traumatic, painful. But then you ask that same couple 10 years down the road, maybe not so bad, quite good. And then you ask them 50 years down the road, yeah, I'm glad we separated. So in that sense, all these events is about how we remembered. The documents are there to only support the memories, the stories that we want to tell about ourselves.
As historians, we always try to explain the context, the background of why certain things happen. So in 1965, Singapore left the Malaysian Federation rather unexpectedly,
Right.
and some would say suddenly. I still remember reading the headlines in historical documents that Singapore is out.
Yes.
So it was rather dramatic. So at that time, everybody came to the conclusion, without the benefit of historical documents, that Singapore was kicked out.
Right.
Because of the suddenness of the event. So that narrative has been in place for a long time, and I think it was reinforced by the image of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew being very emotional at a press conference announcing separation on 9th August 1965. So it looked like he was very traumatized by the whole event. It looked like Singapore had been kicked out and expelled, and that narrative has taken root. But then with the more documents being declassified over the course of time, I think a more complicated story has emerged. And as Chong Wan said, like a divorce, after several years of reflection, with the benefit of more thinking and more knowledge, I think we now have a new and more nuanced interpretation of why Singapore separated. And while it was sudden in that it was announced, and not many people knew about it in August 1965, there were already, I think, some moves for Singapore to leave Malaysia even a year earlier, and there were some discussions between some leaders in Singapore and Malaysian leaders at that time. So it was not sudden, and Singapore, in fact, were negotiating a way to solve the problems that it was facing within the Federation. So now historians tend to describe the period as a negotiated separation rather than expulsion.
But if that's the case, would actually textbooks need to be rewritten?
I think so. I think with the evidence and with the new interpretations, textbooks will have to be rewritten, not so much to change the facts, but to explain in a more nuanced, more layered way what actually happened. Because it was not as straightforward as the Tunku deciding one morning in August that Singapore had to leave, send a letter to Lee Kuan Yew and say, you go, and then the deed was done. It was not as simple as that, you see. So I think we have to now understand the circumstances, and that's why I say the context is important. I think you all have heard of the Albatross File, right?
Yes.
This was a file kept by Dr. Goh Keng Swee for many years, and it's now being declassified. And in that file, you will find documents and evidence of actually negotiations that had started in 1964 about the future of Singapore and Malaysia, leading to an outcome which I think Mr. Lee Kuan Yew himself didn't want, but had to accept in 1965.
Right. Having said that, was separation actually unavoidable? Or perhaps, if you look back, there could actually be certain things that if they were done, then the whole separation issue would not have actually cropped up.
The problems, the challenges of being in Malaysia were evident a year or longer. And so Mr. Lee, in his own memoirs, said that he had delegated Dr. Goh to negotiate with his Malaysian counterparts, Tun Razak, Tunku, for a looser form of federation. And as Mr. Lee himself said in his memoirs, to the effect that he did not expect Dr. Goh to actually negotiate for a separation. Whether it was unavoidable or not, well, we can argue about that. But quite clearly there were issues, and whether it was unavoidable, I think here we got to go back to the issues of why in the first place did we go for merger? And were the terms and conditions, the details, sufficiently worked out? And here, I think, Tai Yong, you may want to more elaborate about Singapore's status. Was it only a British colony? Or, as you have suggested in your IPS Northern lectures, it was perhaps more a, what's the term we use? Port city.
Port city.
Yeah, I personally didn't think that separation was inevitable. If I apply my historian's lenses, because you have to understand things as they happened then,
Sure.
not with the benefit of hindsight.
Right.
So if you looked at Singapore's entry, Singapore wanted very much to be part of the Malaysian Federation. That was what the PAP had aimed for since forming the self-government in 1959. They had been convinced, and with good reasons, that Singapore had no future on its own.
I think before even 59,
Yes.
from the 50s or 54 already, all of us agreed
you
it
needed
had
a
to be
hinterland.
some form of merger or federation
Correct.
with Malaya.
The fact that we really need a hinterland.
Hinterland, yeah. And it was not just the PAP, David Marshall and others, all were convinced
Even
that
the Communist Party.
at some point in time, and the Communist Party was called the Malayan Communist Party. At some point in time, Singapore had to be part of the Federation of Malaysia. So I think there was that belief that this had to happen, and I think the Singapore government worked hard to achieve it in 1963. Now, then, after entering Malaysia, becoming part of the Federation, problems started to unravel. Communal tensions, economic differences, the promise of a common market did not happen, and then personal rivalries and ideological differences, affirmative action, special rights for Malays versus multiracial Malaysia. All these came to the fore. Now, if things had been inevitable, it would have unraveled from the word go. But the point is that I think Singapore tried to salvage the situation through negotiations with their KL counterparts. And this is what the Albatross File was trying to show, that they spoke of ways around it. How about a confederation? How about sharing powers in other ways, where Singapore would have more independence but still be part of the Federation? In fact, the Tunku used a term in 1964 called breakaway. Not so much separation totally, but a confederation where you enjoy a lot more autonomy, but defense, security would still remain in the hands of the KL government. Now, these, of course, does not mean that Singapore would agree to everything that the KL government would say. And that's the other part about inevitably or lack of, because you can't imagine that all Singapore leaders agreed on one solution. There were disagreements, even within the Singapore cabinet. Stay, don't stay. There were groups who say that no matter what, Singapore's future lay in the Federation and we must stay here, make it work. But there was another group that said, no, we've tried and look at what's happening. So it's not working, we might as well get out. So even amongst the leadership, there were differences of opinion. I'm sure in KL circles, it must have been the same. Some groups say, make them stay no matter what, impose tighter control. Another group say, less of a problem if they left us. So all these were trying to be worked out, I think, up to 1965, when the Tunku decided that I think this would not work. Keeping Singapore in would cause more trouble, some bloodshed. Best to let them go. Now, I give you another counterfactual possibility. Now, they could have just arrested the PAP leadership.
And I think they were thinking about that.
Yeah, that was an option. Yeah. Arrest them, impose a military rule or whatever, martial law in Singapore, and keep Singapore in. That could have been a possibility. But I think the Tunku decided in his wisdom that this is not worth the trouble, let Singapore go. And perhaps at some point in future, Singapore will have to come back. This was also thought about. So I think there were many possibilities, and separation was eventually the one that happened. So I would say that it was not inevitable that that was going to happen, but it so happened in history that 1965.
But what about, say, the racial riots in 1964? A lot of course, that was a result of a lot of differences, so on and so forth. But without that, perhaps things would be again different. So it's also the sequencing of events that took place that to some extent also affected the eventual outcome, right?
Yeah, I would say there was a whole series of events that were not anticipated. The differences that led to the race riots, the differences over Singapore's contribution to Malaysia, access to the common market. All these should have been thought out in a bit more detail, but I think the political imperative was to get merger through as soon as possible. So these were perhaps overlooked. I think here we've got to point out what was the part on the Tunku. We wanted to enter Malaysia, join Malaysia, form a federation for a hinterland and access to a common market. But this idea had been there throughout the 50s. And the Malaysians were the primary people saying, no, not ready. Why? You have to remember that in 1962 was the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so the Tunku must have looked at Singapore and how the way the communists were slowly seeping, infiltrating, gaining hold of the party. And Tunku must have decided, no. I'm not going to have a Cuba on my doorstep. So it's better to take Singapore into a federation. Then it becomes an internal security problem and much easier to deal with. And that was what happened in Operation Cold Store.
You know, the idea that the Tunku was keen to take Singapore in actually is also historically inaccurate. Until 1961, the Tunku was saying, no, keep Singapore out, because he was concerned that the demographic of Malaya would be affected once you took Singapore in. Not just the Chinese majority, but he also believed that the left was gaining grounds in Singapore political landscape. And you took in not just 1 million Chinese, but 1 million radicalized Chinese. And you must remember that the Tunku had just fought 12 years of the emergency, or Malaya had just fought 12 years of the emergency. They didn't want all these problems to rise again. So reluctantly, as Chong Wan said, he didn't want a Cuba in his backyard. So he said, better take Singapore in and solve the problem within than live it out. But one factor I would like to raise that really, in a way, influenced Tunku's thinking was Sabah and Sarawak. Because when you fight for a Malaysian Malaysia, you're not only influencing politics in the peninsula, you're also influencing politics in the Borneo territories. Because the political parties there wanted to join Singapore in advocating for a Malaysian Malaysia. And that would have changed the political dynamics of Malaysia. That's why Singapore had to exit, because I think the Tunku felt that if too many people had come in on this movement, then his whole idea of a Malaysia would be challenged. And I think his ultras, many people in UMNO would not accept that.
The role that Dr. Goh Keng Swee played in this whole separation road to independence was actually larger than what we originally thought. And he also, from what I read, he corresponded quite frequently with Australians. So I was just wondering, for each of these pioneers, what kind of role did they actually play in this road to independence, and what personalities did they actually come across with? Like, for instance, people would of course remember Lee Kuan Yew crying, but some people would say, "Oh, those are not real tears." Maybe he wasn't really crying, but he wasn't happy with certain things, And what about then Dr. Goh Keng Swee? What was his personality like, and why did he actually decided on the need for separation? Wonder you have views on this.
I think Dr. Goh, if you have worked with him, you'll find that he was a very decisive person, prepared to take hard decisions, and bring it about. So here, Dr. Goh obviously decided at some point that his cousin, the Malaysian Finance Minister, Tun Siew Sin, was not about to concede, the common market, access to the Malaysian market, and to do what he wanted with Singapore's contribution. So Dr. Goh was then decided, and looking also at the political differences, acrimony between, the Singapore over Malaysia, he must have decided, not worth it, let's cut the links and go. So Dr. Goh was in that group with that Taeyong had identified, who was saying, we tried, it didn't work, let's get out of this. And so that is what I think the Albatross File shows. Dr. Goh's thinking, his jottings as to how he convinced Tun Razak. And then from those jottings, he then presented the case to LKY, who did not expect that Dr. Goh would have negotiated for separation. But if you read Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs, he accepted Dr. Goh's recommendations to go with separation. And I think you'll find it on the last page of volume 1 of Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs that, yes, the Tunku and his colleagues all expected, in their understanding of history, Singapore is totally dependent on Malaysia for its water and exports. It cannot survive on its own. It will have to come back. And as Lee Kuan Yew says, 3 years, 30 years, Singapore will have to go crawling back to Malaysia on their terms. And Ghazali Shafiq was one of those who apparently told that to Lee Kuan Yew. And the last paragraph there says that Lee Kuan Yew, Dr. Goh, were not prepared to go back crawling to Malaysia, and therefore were determined to show that they can make Singapore survive. And this meant here reversing of what they understood to be Singapore's history, that we had always been dependent on the Malaysian hinterland for water, for rubber, tin exports, and everything else here. So that was how it is that we are therefore fortunate that we had this group of leaders who were prepared to rewrite history and show that they can make Singapore independent.
What about E.W. Barker? I think the role that he played, apart from drafting the proclamation, hasn't been much discussed.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether you have, through your research, actually seen more sides of him.
Yeah. Barker was, of course, tasked with drafting the instrument of separation in secret, because they didn't want too many people to know. So he was tasked to do it, and he did it. And he did it very well. I think he belonged to the camp that said that if it's not working, let's get out. Yeah. The three who were most convinced that Singapore had to stay in Malaysia was Rajaratnam, Toh Chin Chye, and Ong Pang Boon. Rajaratnam believed that multiculturalism was the way for Malaysia, and he wanted to stay on and fight. But then he was convinced by Lee Kuan Yew that it was a lost cause. Come out and build a new country, and then we can build a multicultural Singapore.
But you earlier also said, because of kingship, there was a lot of ties, between Malaysia and Singapore. So I think for the leaders as well, it must have been very conflicting for them, especially for those with relatives in Malaysia and even up to today.
Yeah.
Well, actually, if you look at it, half the cabinet at that point of time, their families came from various parts of Malaysia, including especially Penang.
Yeah. I stand corrected, but I think Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was the only Singaporean born in the cabinet, the first cabinet. The rest all had ties
all
with.
somewhere other Malaysia.
And the story of Mr. Devan Nair, who won a seat in the elections, in the federal elections in 19... He didn't want to come back because he said, I owe it to the people who elected me to stay on and fight in Parliament.
Right.
And I was told, it took 2.5 years for Mr. Lee to persuade him to come back because he didn't want to come back. Yeah. So there were people who believed that staying on and continuing the battle was the right thing to do. But I think Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, in his wisdom, decided, let's build a new country. Singapore would be its own state. Let's build our new country in the vision that we have always believed in, and it's multiculturalism.
I think here you see the tenacity of historical memories. So what I think is not realized, and Tanya can correct me, if you look at that group of leaders, Tun Razak and all the Singapore leaders, they went through Raffles College. And the history textbooks at that point of time were written by the British colonials, in particular Richard Winstead and Frank Swettenham. Those were the two key history textbooks at that point of time that argued that Singapore was an integral part of Malaya. In fact, Winstead said that, look, if you look at it, Singapore had no history until 1947. It was part of the street settlement, which was only disbanded in 1947. And then only Singapore had a history of its own. So once you got that history steeped into your mind, that, historically we are part of Malaya. Economically, we are dependent on Malaya. In terms of water supplies, we are dependent on Malaya. So obviously then it's a no-brainer that we had to remain somehow or other in a federation. Now that begs the question, before Singapore became the export point for Malayan tin, rubber, timber in 1874 onwards, when the British opened up the Malay Peninsula, how did Singapore survive? From 1819 to 1874, when the British then went into the peninsula and there was development, and then tin was starting to be exported in greater quantities. And if you look at the record, it was the China trade that Singapore survived on basically from 1819 to 1874. So you have to think of how these deep historical memories shape, the perceptions of our leaders here.
Sure. I also found it very interesting that while the leaders were so torn with differences in views on whether to have the separation, after the separation was actually met, there were a lot of people, folks, common men in the streets celebrating. In fact, they were letting off firecrackers in Chinatown. So how do you actually explain that? Was there some kind of, I would say, I not just difference, but somehow the people were happier than the leaders, in the separation. Why was that the case?
I think the people who let off firecrackers, from what I remember
Chinatown
reading,
mainly.
was
Chinatown.
actually the Chinese merchants.
Merchants, yes.
The Chinese merchants. I think Lee Kuan Yew recounted this in his memoirs. And I think they had felt, as you said, the frustration of not having the common market, and then the communal oppression, the fear that, are we going to survive in a kind of a Malay-dominated economy, society? So I think after watching the situation for 2 years plus, they realized that maybe we are better off on our own without all the hassles, the communal tensions, the political attacks, and the communal riots that may happen again. So they kind of celebrated separation. But Lee Kuan Yew also said later on, a couple of pages down, that actually the civil servants were quite worried. And there was quiet that day because they all went home early because they anticipated more communal problems. So I think the feeling was probably quite mixed. One group feeling perhaps, about time we got out. So same as the cabinet, right? Another group feeling that maybe we should have stayed on and make it work. And then a group say, oh, what awaits us now, We've always argued that Singapore had no future without Malaysia, and now we're out. What awaits us? What's going to happen to us? And I think that's where the next chapter of Singapore's story begins.
Right. So we earlier also spoke about the Albatross, the fact that it's to be, or rather it's already declassified. So with more of such materials, that we can get on hold of, how do you think Singaporeans should now approach our history?
I will say that with more documents, then it falls on historians to make good use of these documents, to write a more nuanced, a more layered history of Singapore, And the history need not be a kind of a national education history where we celebrate that, we overcame the odds and that sort of thing. But to understand the difficult journey that Singapore took, and not to assume that any of this was destined.
That it could have gone.
Yeah, that it could have gone in so many ways, and can't imagine that the future of Singapore will be bright and glorious because, we were always destined to be good or to end up well. So I think those history lessons will remind us that we could have gone so many ways. And Singapore, there were paths taken, paths not taken, could have emerged very differently. So I think a better appreciation of the difficult journey of a complicated journey of nationhood would serve, I think, future populations well.
The Albatross File or document or whatever you call it, what can we actually expect from it? Have you actually read part of it?
Actually, there were some parts which are interesting because they detailed the negotiations that Goh Keng Swee had conducted with his counterparts in KL.
Tun Razak mainly.
Razak mainly. And because it had to be kept quite secret. So
right.
Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Razak, Tunku. But the rest were like newspaper clippings of what's happening. So it's not as explosive as people think it to be, but it does show a different understanding of how separation happened. From the first question he asked, sudden expulsion to a negotiated separation. I think the Albatross Files shows the latter.
I see. So, because I was thinking maybe he had a lot of secrets in it, but maybe not the case.
Yeah.
I see.
But why do you think Dr. Goh named it Albatross File?
Okay, very simply because, there is this poem by a man called Coleridge written in the 18th century called the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So this ancient mariner he shot an albatross, which to sailors is bad to shoot
It's
an
a good
albatross.
bird.
Yeah, it's a good bird.
The omen of where you are.
Yeah, so to punish this man, this sailor, they put the albatross around his neck, you see. So the albatross around the neck basically is a burden. So Goh Keng Swee felt that Malaysia had become a burden. It was an albatross around our neck, and that's why he called the file Albatross.
Right.
It's a very British Anglo-American allusion that unless you are familiar with that story and the symbolism of the albatross to Western mariners, you won't understand why he called it Albatross.
But I think to our readers, it would be very interesting because our readers would never have thought, why that name?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming today to share with us all these nice stories. And we look forward to even more in time to come. Thank you.
Pleasure's ours. Thank you very much.
Thank you.